Welcome to Volunteer Corner. We're so lucky today to have this is Reta Ismail. Now, Rita is an anchor on the weekend at CTV News. She's also a reporter, but she has been so great for the food bank. I know you've interviewed us a number of times. I know we've been up to the station doing your podcast. That was a great thing there. Jane and I really enjoyed it. You went back over our lives and kind of examined it, but in the process, we learned about you. And I think you're somebody that's far more interesting as a person than I am, and you have such a great background. I'm sure that that goes into your reporting and into your life as well. I know, Rita, that you were born in Baghdad, uh, but
Mhm.
the life since then has been phenomenal. Can you just quickly take us through how you got from there to here today?
For sure. Well, thank you so much for having me on Volunteer Corner. And I am so honored about all the wonderful things that you said. My life has certainly been
Mhm.
interesting. And as you mentioned, I was born in Baghdad, Iraq. And in 1990, when the Gulf War was starting, my parents decided to pack up with their four kids, all under the age of 10, and head on a one-way flight to Greece just so that we would be safe. We lived in a refugee welcome home for about 3.5 years in Greece before we were sponsored by my mother's family to come to Canada. And we settled in Toronto for about 6 months with my grandparents. And then we went into our own apartment for 3.5 years before my parents were able to get on their feet and move to Hamilton. So I technically call Hamilton where I grew up. London is home now. I met my
Mhm.
husband and moved here. So definitely been a lot of places and been through a lot in
And
the
you've covered a
last
lot of interesting
year.
stories too, right? Like you've covered the Syrian refugees when that all was happening, and I know when you come down, you covered a couple of interesting stories from the food bank and what's going on. But I often wonder what it's like for media folks. We know media well. I should say at the outset that food banks would probably not exist if it wasn't for the media, right? We are unique media creations. I mean, when they first got going, we had no expertise. This is 40 years ago. We had no expertise. There was no Facebook back then or anything like that. We really had to depend on the media to tell the story. And it happened across the country. Media did a great job for food banks, but especially here in London. We've just been so fortunate. But I do find myself wondering at times what media must think as they cover the Canadian landscape now. Like, I know there's the really interesting stories, individual ones you can go and cover. But for me, as somebody who's been a food bank director for 40 years, I've seen the country in many ways change so much as to how it handles and how it treats its vulnerable people. And I'm sure that you've covered a lot of those stories as well. But since your time in London and with all that you've been doing, is it difficult for a person to stay objective in some of those stories? That's maybe a silly question, but I would have some difficulties with that, I would think.
For sure. And you know what? The media has had a hand in sort of doing these stories and covering some of the incredible work that all of the resources we have here in London sort of pull
Yeah.
together, especially the food bank. But for me personally, having been through what I've been in terms of coming to this country as a refugee, and I've mentioned this to you a few times. Just in chats between you and I, we used a food bank. Like in
Yeah.
Hamilton, I remember my dad taking us with him to the food bank and to get the food. And I have chills every time I think about it because it brings me back to this place where, as a child, you don't know what's happening. But then as an adult, you look back and you think, this is how my parents were putting food on the table for us. And,
Mhm.
fortunate for us, they were able to start their own business, go to school, work, and provide for four children. And we were, that perfect story of being able to transition out of the system and being able to, afford to sort of live. Now, as a reporter, when I cover these stories, I get emotional. I don't make it about myself for obvious reasons, but internally, it's always a bit of it's like a happy thing that I get to cover
Mhm.
this great work that's happening, but it also breaks my heart that this many years in, and it almost seems like it's worse. Like the climate is a little bit more difficult. And again, you and I and Jane have discussed how the food bank usage has skyrocketed and it's on an all-time high. And it brings you to a place of like, you struggle in terms of like, why are we here?
Mhm.
And it's sort of, it's, for lack of a better word, it just sucks that we can't get out of this. And it's no longer people like myself and my family, newcomers. It's your
Yeah.
everyday neighbor. It's people
Yeah.
who are working and they still are relying on the system. So for sure, it becomes a bit of a struggle when you cover those stories because it's humanity, right? You
Yeah.
feel sorry that there's this many people relying on a service that's wonderful, but
Yeah.
unfortunately it exists.
We'll occasionally come across a journalist who will be very matter of fact about things, right? So they will cover a human interest story at the food bank or just talk about the food bank trends. But you have never been one of those journalists. I mean, every time we talk to you, you're right there. You're very present in the moment, which Jane and I both think is really great. But at the same time, I think your background I would think really qualifies you well to tell these kind of stories. Kind of get
Mm,
drawn in, and that really
yeah.
qualifies you well also as, for the want of a better word, as a storyteller. So you're telling the factual
Oh,
stuff
thank
that's really going on, but there is something to it that's kind of enthralling and draws people in. Do you recognize in yourself that you have that? Or do you think that's something that you probably largely put aside in order to tell the story? I'm interested.
Yeah, no, thank you for saying that. It really means a lot. One of my top priorities is to tell you a story that'll make you feel something. And
Yeah.
because I feel it when I'm interviewing you, and or when I covered the Syrian refugees, I
Yeah.
felt what they were going through. So
Yeah.
it is great to be able to relate, and it does make you a better journalist. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about my career here in London the past decade is I've covered so many stories that I
Hmm.
have been able to relate to. I do tend to put it on the side because as a journalist, it's not
You have to.
about you or your
Hmm.
story,
Hmm.
right? So I do that, but even when I was anchoring full time, um, I would struggle getting through a specific read that showed human struggle, right?
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and that's something that you build up and you're able to get through it. But for me it was just sort of uh, again, I go back to how we're in this place and sort of stuck there. And
Yeah.
then I don't know. It just it does impact me. I do put it on the side, but I'm glad that people are able to see that when I tell a story, especially if it is something that involves a community and what people are going through, that they feel what I'm feeling because I'm not just reading it and I'm not just
Yeah.
interviewing any random person. It means a lot to me.
Yeah. I remember once our very first trip to Sudan, CBC came with us, and the journalist that covered it was just a rock hard journalist who'd been through all sorts of
Ugh.
conflicts and war zones and everything else. And what he saw there is we were fighting a lot of the slavery issues and stuff that were going over. This is 25 years ago, but he broke down after a period of time. It was just because we were in there for 2 weeks. It was just impossible for him to suddenly extricate himself from that situation. But other
Mhm,
people just
mhm.
automatically get into it. Like I'm like that. Jane is like that. I think you're like that as well. But part of the reason why I got you on Volunteer Corner is because I was down at the food bank over Christmas, and there was one volunteer that came up to me. I was doing some videoing there for some B-roll for a thing I was doing, and the person wanted me to know how much she really appreciated volunteering at the food bank. I said, well, that's great. I'm really glad you came here. And it was because she had heard the podcast that you had done with
Oh,
Jane and I. Now, I had no idea. Jane didn't either. But she was so affected by that. And I must say, we have about 3,000 people on our database at the food bank. And that's a wonderful thing. And we've been very fortunate that way. But I would have to say that the vast majority have gotten to know about the food bank through the media. That's the way that it is. Like we're not out there seeing everybody, right? We're down at the food bank having to do it. We don't send out newsletters or those kind of things. We
mhm,
do send out
mhm.
social media posts, those kind of things. But the human interest stories have really come from the media, not just you, but others. But especially in this instance, You did it in such a way that you drew out the humanity. And I don't know if it was you or if it was us, but whatever it was, that volunteer decided that the food bank was the place that they had wanted to be. And I haven't seen you
I,
since then, but I did want to thank you for that, Rita, because that person was
oh my
motivated to
goodness.
come down not just by an instinct to help, but by a story that they heard well orchestrated by you by interviewing some other people.
It's funny because not everyone's as receptive of us covering
Yeah,
everything, right? And
yeah,
you and Jane, everyone at the food bank has always been so welcoming. Like I'll text you last minute and you'll make yourself
yeah,
available. So it
yeah,
is a two-way relationship, right? You guys
yeah.
have made yourself available. We're able to work together and tell these amazing stories to get the volunteers out, to get the donations out. And that is probably the most rewarding part about this career is when you're able to do work that has a positive impact. So that podcast, if it only generated that one volunteer, that to me is incredible. So thank you for sharing that, Glenn. I appreciate it.
People often make a deal, Rita, about Jane and I, and they try to tell the story kind of through that lens. But in actuality, the media has its own unique characters. Like I think of people like Nick Paparella, and just how awesome he has been. He comes and covers everything that we do. I think of people like Randy Richmond from the London Free Press, who had come to Sudan with us, right? I think of Kathy Mueller, who used to
That's
be at
it.
your station, who came to Sudan with us as well.
Mhm.
People forget that these people aren't just telling stories; they're telling those kind of stories. Sometimes because the editor sends them out, the assignment or the day editor sends them out, but other times they say, "I want to cover that one." Right. And I do think that that's what keeps people from feeling despair in moments right now. Like Food Bank, we're helping now 6,000 families a month. 40 other agencies. We're feeding 10% of London. So you can sit down and talk about that and really get down in the dumps just about how much that has increased. On the other hand, when people hear stories that come across about volunteers, or when you do interview somebody like Jane or I, or people get in and boost a food drive or something like that that's going on, it's very, very difficult to stay down in the dumps. The people who tell these stories are often people that select those stories. They are responsible to an assignment editor. But I remember when Kathy Mueller from the TV station here came to, she had to go to all the powers that be and say, this is what I wanted to do. And there might be times when an editor doesn't want it done or somebody doesn't want to pay that expense. But these journalists fight for these stories, right? And they're not always
Mhm.
the most interesting, like in the moment type of thing, sudden disaster, something that happened. They're just aware that their community is going through something and they would like to be able to reveal that to the public. And I think you are very much one
For
of
sure.
those people. We know others as well. But what a great thing to direct a food bank the way that Jane and I do and be able to talk to people who say, I hear you. Now let's help us. Let us help you to get it out. That means a lot to us, Rita. And it's now been 4 decades for us, and it's always been the same. The media has always
I
been
love
terrific to us. And then there's certain personalities in that media that really stick out to us because I think
oh,
I think it's important that we express our appreciation to you and the other media folks as well.
Thank you so much. Honestly, that means more than you'll ever know, Glenn. And then on the note of being assigned a story, yes, there are days by all means when you come in and they're like, the food bank has its launch here or this or that.
Mhm.
But as a journalist, you get the freedom of how to tell that story, right?
Yeah, that's
So
true.
even if
Yeah,
it's not something, yeah. So that's the trick is being able to tell that story and finding those people like yourself, like the volunteers, like the
yeah,
people who come in and donate. Remember that one story we did about the Sikh community coming out and they had a
yeah,
couple of truckloads and it was
yeah.
so special because that's a group that probably wouldn't have known
That's right.
before that,
Yeah.
right?
When you think about how impossible it seems for the food banks across the country at this particular time, there was a story in Maclean's magazine this week that a feature story that talks about why are the country's food banks collapsing, right? And they talked about the Ottawa Food Bank and stuff that was going on there. That's not happening in London. And part of the reason why it's
Correct.
not is because we depend so much on the media to tell the story. And as soon as the public or the businesses, the cultural groups, faith groups, whatever, service clubs, as soon as they hear that story, the next thing you know, and you can see it after every story, food starts coming in. People see those stories and it makes them want
Wow.
to donate. And we live in a really generous community, but you make that kind of thing possible. I really appreciate you doing this, Rita. And I hope you realize how much you mean to us, not just to Jane and I, but as an organization. If it wasn't for folks like you telling not just the story, but the human side of it, I don't think people would be supporting us nearly as much. So thank you.
You are so kind. Thank you so much.